Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, a stampede breaks out as thousands of people file past to see the body of former Zimbabwean President Robert Mugabe. His family snubs the government's plans to bury him in Harare, saying that he will instead be laid to rest in a private ceremony. Also, voting with their feet, or not, Tunisian women from rural communities often don't make it to elections. Ahead of this weekend's presidential vote, they're concerned that the lack of transport will once again mean a low turnout from the female electorate. And flux and flow. 2019 marks the 25th year of Bamako Encounters. The photography and video biennale takes place in Mali in November, but it officially kicks off in Paris this week. I speak to the artistic director about his vision for the exhibition. The first Thursday was the beginning of 3 days of lying in state for the body of Zimbabwe's former leader, Robert Mugabe. Several people were injured in a stampede caused by surging crowds of people filing past to view the 95-year-old's remains at the Rufari Stadium in Harare. After he died in Singapore last Friday, there'd been uncertainty as to where he would ultimately be buried. President Emerson Mnangagwa's government had planned on presiding over a lavish ceremony on Sunday, but Mugabe's family have snubbed his successor, saying that he will instead be buried at a private ceremony. It's not clear when that's going to happen or where. Ryan Truscott tells us more.
It won't affect the actual funeral service. That's still going to go ahead on Saturday. And so far, we've got 11 serving African presidents who say they'll attend, including Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa and Uhuru Kenyatta of Kenya. 8 former presidents will also be coming. It's likely to be the biggest funeral this country's ever seen. But what people won't see is the actual burial of Mugabe. And that's now going to take place sometime next week in private. It'll be strictly a family affair, we're told. That's according to a family spokesman. But the spokesman wouldn't say where the final resting place will be, though it was reported earlier that Mugabe wanted to be buried in his rural home of Kutama, which is around 100 kilometers from Harare.
Now, the family of Mugabe had actually accused Mnangagwa's government of trying to coerce them into allowing him to be buried at Heroes Acres. Why do they feel that way?
Well, that's right. I mean, the government had planned all along for Mugabe to be buried on Sunday at the National Heroes Acre. It was expected that he'd be buried there because he has been declared a national hero, and that President Mnangagwa would preside over the ceremony. I think the suspicion was that Mnangagwa's government was trying to use the burial as a way of endorsing his presidency and uniting everyone behind him. One of Mugabe's nephews, Patrick João, said today that the government's burial plans were contrary to what Mugabe wanted. He said he didn't want Mnangagwa pontificating, that was the word he used, over his uncle's body. So there's evidently still a lot of bitterness from some family members towards Mnangagwa over his role in ousting Mugabe from power 2 years ago. Mnangagwa, though, did visit the family today to pay his condolences, and he's reported to have told them that his government will support the family and go along with whatever it decides regarding the burial of Mugabe.
Now, Khartoum's seen its biggest protest since the transitional government was announced. Thousands of people marched demanding judicial and legal reform, and for the Sovereign Council formed last month to keep pushing for justice for demonstrators. Many were killed in the uprising that led to the ousting of former long-time strongman Omar al-Bashir back in April. Protesters want the chief of the judiciary and the general prosecutor to be sacked because of their ties to al-Bashir's regime. Now, only 2 of the 26 candidates running for president in Tunisia this weekend are women. The lack of female candidates is one problem. The low female voter turnout is another. Getting more women to participate in the poll means tackling logistical issues and feelings of disenfranchisement, as our correspondents tell us more.
Through the South Tunisian desert, Insaf and her colleagues drive for hours. They're part of a campaign to convince more women in rural areas to go and vote.
Here, women are afraid to vote. They're worried their votes are wasted. They're thinking, if I vote, what will change?
In remote communities, many women feel disillusioned and there's little access to information about candidates' policies. One study last year put turnout among women in the municipal elections at just 20%. Those that do vote want to make more informed choices.
We don't know who to choose. Women will often ask a friend who they voted for and then just vote for the same person because she doesn't know how to make a good decision by herself.
There are logistical hurdles too. Rural regions don't have much public transport, so the trip to the polling station can be difficult for people like Ranima.
I often hitchhike, wait on the road until someone agrees to pick me up. But honestly, it's exhausting. It's exhausting to go and vote in these conditions.
The government has discussed polling station accessibility at length, but is yet to find a solution. Women feel they're not properly represented by politicians, and activists say paying lip service to their concerns is not enough.
Unfortunately, it's become a strategy for male and female politicians to play the women's rights card. But we want it to be a priority, and not just a card to play.
More women than men have registered to vote ahead of Sunday's poll, but there are fears this won't translate to a turnout as high as the previous election.
Addis Ababa is cracking down on people working on its streets. A new law has been drafted banning begging and sex work, and rehabilitation centres have been set up ahead of that. Nicolas Chemin tells us more.
Bertukan has been a beggar in Addis Ababa for 4 years. She's 18 years old and 7 months pregnant.
No one chooses to become a prostitute or a beggar if they have work or a roof over their head. We want training, but above all, we want a roof.
She's worried because the city has just drafted a law that will ban begging. Sex work will also be forbidden. Officials say 50,000 people live on the streets and about 10,000 others are sex workers. The city has opened rehabilitation centres. Sidi Reder was on the streets for 3 months before coming here.
This center has helped me to discover myself and quit my addictions. I want to be educated, then be employed, and help my family.
The head of Addis Ababa's Social and Labour Affairs Unit says it's not always easy to convince people to come to the rehabilitation centres.
Some of them are not interested in taking part in these projects. They say they can earn easy money. They sometimes not only beg, but take part in criminal activities.
The aim of the ban is to improve the city's image. But without real long-term opportunities, beggars in Addis Ababa will be forced back out onto the streets.
Well, 2019 marks the 25th year of Bamako Encounters. The photography and video biennale takes place in Mali in November, but officially kicked off this week in Paris. This year's theme of Streams of Consciousness focuses on notions of flux and flow, from people to culture to communication. About 85 artists from across the continent and the diaspora will be showcasing their work. Dr. Bonaventure Beijing Ndikung is the artistic director who's conceived of much of the exhibition. Earlier, I spoke to him about his inspiration and hopes.
Well, first of all, we're hoping to present a plethora of artists from the African world, photographers, around the theme of streams of consciousness, so different, looking at it literally, but also metaphorically, looking at the idea of a flow of ideas, from the moment, something makes click and you choose to take a photograph to the moment that somebody visits an exhibition and sees it, but also looking at streams of consciousness as a kind of a connection between the continent, African continent, and its various diasporas, So the point of departure is a sonic piece by Max Roach and Abdullah Ibrahim from 1977, which I think as a point of departure to look at different flows, So also thinking about rivers, the River Niger, the Nile, the Mississippi River, and how these have become, emblematic in the transformation and passage of cultures, So that is...
Talking about the passage of cultures, how important do you think that it is to have how important do you think that events like this are in terms of changing perceptions of the continent?
They're very important. We just watched the news, what you just did, and you look at the images presented about the African continent and the African world. It's usually very stereotypical, a certain narrative out there, while there's so much happening on the continent. So there's a kind of a battle of images, So how do we take that in our hands, and how do we present the African continent in a different light, besides and beyond the narratives of political problems and so on and so forth, but the multitude of cultures and extremely deep, the wealth of cultures on the African continent, in the African world, so we're working on that. That's why, the 85 artists we've brought together, really from Brazil, Haiti, Mali, Cameroon, South Africa, the USA, Canada, Germany, wherever, but people of African origins living in those places and have something to say about, an Africanity and Africanness.
So Dr. Bonaventure So Beijing Indikung there speaking to me a little earlier on. The Biennale kicks off on November the 30th and runs until January 2020. That is, though, all we have time for. Thanks for joining us. Do so again. Take care.
Liberté, égalité, actualité.